Oh, this is a Dell, so I can. It's a Dell, so I can just pull it out.
Are we gonna? We're gonna have panels. Oh, okay. No, never mind. Okay, so you're gonna stay there, and you're gonna come up afterwards. Yes. Good morning. Wow, that's loud. Good morning. How's everyone? Awesome. I love it. Great. I am so super duper excited to be here this morning. Welcome to the third annual Parren Mitchell Symposium. You are in for a super duper treat today. I just want to welcome you briefly, and then I'll get out of the way so that we can start the panel. So in the program, you're going to see some information about Parren Mitchell. He's on the second page. You definitely want to read that. But there's two things that I want to really highlight about Parren Mitchell for those that may not know who he is. One, he was a phenomenal congressman who sued the University of Maryland to actually take classes on the University of Maryland College Park campus. And so we're quite excited about that. And it kind of comes full circle because just a couple of years ago, I think it was last year, we actually renamed the sociology building after Parren Mitchell. So he sues the University of Maryland to get a master's degree in sociology, and now there's a building named after, our building is named after him. So I think that that's quite phenomenal, and that speaks volumes to the kind of phenomenal man that he is. So please take the time to read his quick bio that's in the program. Secondly, I want to acknowledge the people that are viewing us by live stream. Thank you so much for viewing. Unfortunately, can't be here, but we do appreciate that you're online with us. I want to thank several people that are here. First and foremost, I have got to thank the hardest people I know, the hardest working people that I know in entertainment, as they say, right? So Karina and Wendy, you have to stand up so I can give you a big shout out and say thank you for all the work that you have done. I also want to thank a few of our sponsors, and so I want to make sure I don't miss anybody. I want to thank BSOS, that's our college, so thank God for them. They're always so incredibly supportive of us as well as the Parren Mitchell Symposium. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion, thank you so much. African American Studies, of course, sociology, the Critical Race Initiative, the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, CRGE. I also want to send a shout out to my health fair people. So when I call your name, just kind of wave your hand at me. City Year. Yay, City Year. The University Health Center. Yes. Okay. The Minute Clinic. The College Pantry. Okay, all right, so we want to just say welcome to our health fair. So we're having a health fair. The way in which today is going to go, we're going to have a morning panel from 11 to 1, a small break, and then we're going to have our second panel that starts at about 2 o'clock. So please go and visit the health fair in between the sessions or quietly during the sessions. So I've thanked people that I needed to thank. I also wanted to let you know on your seats you should have a index card. At the end of the session, we're going to write your questions down. At the end of the session, we're going to take your questions and we're going to have a Q&A. So be sure and write your questions down so that we can answer your questions at the end of the panels. Now, I've got to stop and pause for a second. This is a very important day for me because it's the Critical Race Initiative's 3rd Annual Parren Mitchell Symposium, but most importantly, it is a chance for me to publicly acknowledge the man who means so incredibly much to me in this sociology department. I call him a neighbor, I call him a colleague, and most importantly, I call him my newly tenured friend. So would you please stand to your feet and let's give Rayshawn Ray a big shout out. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dean Gregory Ball. It's really funny because I have such a dean that's so present. Literally, my dean will call me, will just send me an email and say, hey, Chris, great job. I'm really afraid when I see an email from the dean, but every time I open it, it's so positive. So I'm always so excited that we have a dean that is so incredibly present and is so supportive of his faculty and staff. So I want to introduce to you none other than Gregory Ball.
I'm delighted to be here. As Chris said, I'm the guy who's lucky enough to be Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. And one of the things I love are events like this, which I think capture what we're all about so well. First, we're honoring one of our graduates who, as Chris has mentioned, went through quite an odyssey in order to get his degree. This is Parren Mitchell, who was a long-term member of Congress from Maryland's 7th Congressional District in Baltimore. He founded the Congressional Black Caucus along with 12 of his colleagues. He served as chairman of many important committees where he did his best to make a difference. And one of the reasons why it's so appropriate that this symposium be named after him is not only because of his achievements, but because he personified taking social science research and combining it with attacking problems of policy that were important to people in this country, and especially the African American community. So that kind of inspirational leadership is the kind of thing we value and we try to train in our students today. And this is one of many ways that we honor his legacy. And as Chris noted, we recently renamed the Art Sociology building in his honor, which is entirely appropriate for us to do in this way. Now, the topic of today's symposium could not be of greater importance. Health disparities, in general, the health of this country is foundational to everything we try to do. And like so many things in the United States, it's characterized by variance. We have among the best healthcare you can get anywhere in the world, but at the same time, we have pockets, and not so small pockets in some cases, of health situations which are comparable to what goes on in some of the most challenging countries in the developing world. This kind of variance, this kind of difficulty in getting everyone the kind of care they deserve cannot be tolerated. To be a healthy country, to attain our goals, we need to take head on this challenge of variance as it applies to health and try to consider solutions, causes and solutions. And this symposium today is going to attack that problem with a set of experts who I'm proud to say come from across the college and cut across colleges. So, you know, in addition to sociology, colleagues in anthropology and colleagues in African American studies are participating in this symposium, and colleagues in the School of Public Health are all participating. And this is just the sort of thing that I want to facilitate and encourage in my tenure, and we want to see more of, so that we can take the academic discourse, the scholarship, and apply it to one of the most difficult problems our society faces. So, like Chris, I think I want to tell you, you're all in for a great treat today, and I'm very pleased to be able to kick it off. So I guess I'd like to invite Chris to come take over.
Yeah, that's my dean. He's pretty darn fabulous. And, you know, when I make a mistake, I am quickly one to acknowledge the mistake. So I'm excited today, you know, for Rayshawn, for the symposium, for everything. So there are two entities that I forgot to thank. One being Dean Russell. Dean Russell, thank you so much. And Dean Nickerson, thank you so much for being here. But I also forgot to thank my panelists. And so I want to thank all my panelists for being here. We had dinner last night, and some of you weren't privy to the dinner, but it was a really tasty conversation. And so I'm excited for that tasty conversation. I'm hoping this morning we can continue that delicious conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, and she's going to introduce the panelists, and we're going to go forward from there.
Thank you, Chris. I don't think I can replicate the infectiousness of Chris, but I will certainly try here. Welcome to the first panel titled Health Outcomes for Better or for Worse. It's really exciting. It really features scholars and leading researchers on health disparities, racial health disparities in particular, and this panel focuses specifically on race and racism and how they shape health outcomes. My name is Thurka Sengar-Morthy. I'm a medical anthropologist and an applied public health researcher in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland here. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for this panel, Dr. Celeste Watkins Hayes, who's Associate Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is a widely published author and educator who is credited for her public policy research and work targeting low-income families. She's currently the principal investigator of the Health, Hardship, and Renewal Study, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Health Investigator Award and the National Science Foundation's Early Career Award. Her study, or the current funded study, examines the social and economic consequences of HIV/AIDS in Chicago for women of diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Celeste Watkin-Hayes.
Good morning. I want to just make sure that my technology is doing what I need it to do here. Okay. It is wonderful to be here, and I want to thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to present the opening keynote, and I want to thank in particular Chris Marsh and newly tenured Rayshawn Ray, Karina and Wendy for their fabulous work in putting this together. And Chris is absolutely right. It was a wonderful discussion last night, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation that's going to unfold today. So I thank you in advance for bringing me here. What I want to talk about is the study that Thurka just discussed, part of the health hardship and renewal study. And I want to start by framing it in this way. Injuries of inequality, big and small wounds to personal, familial, community, well-being represent the mental, physical, and social toll of complex inequalities. From gunshot wounds wrought by street violence to the lead poisoning endured by residents of an American city, these are the cumulative markers and scars of economic and social marginalization, the visible and invisible evidence of disadvantage. Injuries of inequality have gendered, racialized, sexualized, and class dimensions, as the likelihood of occurrence is not random, but rather shaped by social group membership. Injuries of inequality produce and are produced by a compromised ability to protect oneself from harm. Social science research has extensively analyzed the mechanisms that inflict injuries upon disadvantaged groups, the causes of mass incarceration, residential segregation, and unemployment. We've documented the injuries themselves and their short and long-term effects and implications, outcomes around education, health, housing, and economic well-being. We've also looked at the ways in which individuals and communities respond, identifying the processes of identity formation, everyday survival, and political resistance in a context of constraint and confinement. Studying the lives of women living with HIV is a logical site to continue the exploration of injury. There are currently 1.2 million people living with HIV/AIDS in the US, with an estimated 50,000 new infections each year. It's well documented that AIDS is an epidemic of social inequality. Societal marginalization on the basis of race, class, gender, and sexuality plays significant roles in determining who's most at risk of infection, who's most likely to receive life-saving treatment, and how the epidemic disproportionately affects certain communities. HIV increasingly operates as a concentrated epidemic in the US, with high rates among specific subpopulations. Blacks bear the most severe burden, making up only 12% of the US population, yet comprising 44% of new infections and people living with HIV. 1 in 4 people currently living with HIV in the US is female. Black MSM represent approximately 36% of estimated new HIV infections among all MSM. The rate of new HIV infections among Black women was 20 times that of white women in 2010. And it's estimated, as we know, we understand that geography and class intersect with the racialized and gendered dimensions of the epidemic. It's estimated that 2.1% of heterosexuals living in high poverty urban areas in the US are HIV positive, a rate well above the 1% that designates a generalized epidemic. Consequently, the CDC identifies poverty as the single most important demographic factor associated with HIV infection among inner-city heterosexuals. For individuals who experience intersectional marginality, HIV represents a significant threat to their health and well-being. But an interesting puzzle emerged as I began what has been over a decade of research on the lives of women living with HIV in Chicago. I heard countless stories of trauma and struggle, but I also heard stories of transformation. Women talked about a trajectory of dying from AIDS to living with HIV. I became deeply curious as the number of transformation accounts grew. Were these women simply offering rationalization and positive thinking to combat a deadly health scare?
Was this merely a story about the effectiveness of highly active antiretroviral therapy and other medical discoveries used to treat HIV? Or was something else happening, something that would shed light on the larger issue of what it might take for us to address the injuries wrought by intersectional disadvantage? What facilitates, and it's wonderful to talk about intersectionality and be in Patricia Hill Collins's university. This is fantastic for me. What facilitates significant and even radical transformations in our circumstances and life chances? And one of the most jarring sentiments coming out of my research, I frequently heard the following: if it were not for HIV, I'd probably be dead. Lest this begin to sound like a dangerous and factually inaccurate narrative that romanticizes or downplays the devastation of AIDS, or points to some kind of deviance on the part of the participants of my research, let me be clear and reveal my argument up front. What these women were bringing to light is that the opportunities, and perhaps more importantly, the resources to personally heal from, economically and socially navigate, and politically confront injuries of inequality were granted when they had access to a mammoth and well-connected network that afforded women the chance to massively restructure their lives. The transformations that these women experience are deeply social phenomenon, where critical and meaningful interactions take place at the network, institutional, and policy levels that improve the quality of their lives. Explaining these transformations, the movement from death to life in contexts of stigmatization and disadvantage, is the goal at the center of my work. There's a growing social science literature that captures life transformations in disadvantaged contexts, such as Edward Orozco Flores' God's Gangs, Lawrence Ralph's Renegade Dreams, Rob Sanson and John Lobb's Desistance from Crime Over the Life Course, and Sharon Osseling's Leaving Prostitution. While not explicitly framed as what I call a sociology of transformative agency until now, the texts nevertheless have several things in common. First, they identified key environmental challenges that constrain everyday lives and long-term opportunity and demonstrate how those forces inflict injuries of inequality upon those in their path. Next, they explicate the adapted responses of individuals living under these conditions and point to how some of these adopted strategies further undermine individuals' quality of life and life chances. Some behavior may be illegal, such as gun violence and drug dealing. Other behavior not illegal, but carrying a certain amount of hazard, such as sexual risk-taking. The strategies prove threatening to one's health and to the overall health of their communities. Where this research diverges from much of the urban poverty literature is in its focus on the social processes by which these same individuals later seek out alternative strategies and ways of being after previously adopted strategies prove problematic to the actor. For example, Flores documents the processes by which young Latino gang members exit gang life by cultivating a reformed barrio masculinity through religiously oriented gang recovery programs. The men advance redemption scripts that describe their transformations from their perspectives, facilitating recovery and carving out new spaces for legitimacy in a societal context that often seeks to push them to the margins. To be sure, texts that document what I'm calling transformative agency explicitly and implicitly challenge explanations that point to a pathology to be quote unquote fixed among individuals. Through nuanced ethnographic fieldwork, these authors are able to show how transformative agency, just like the original adopted strategies, is deeply embedded in context. And the authors emphasize the policies and conditions that marginalize, as well as those that facilitate the transformation. So since my work is about transformation, what supports it, what obstructs it, what happens when people are able to do it successfully under difficult conditions, I've engaged in longitudinal research to deeply explore this process, what I call the transformative project. For over a decade, I've been conducting qualitative research with a group working through their own movements from death to life, HIV-positive women. My research team and I have explored how HIV-positive women transition from believing and behaving as though they have a death sentence at diagnosis to interpreting and coping with HIV as a chronic but manageable illness. But while this research is ostensibly about managing the health implications of HIV/AIDS, the broader goal is to think about how people reconfigure the ways in which they navigate complex and intersectional inequality and their injuries. So in 2004, I began Sister to Sister, a qualitative study of 30 African American women living with HIV/AIDS in Chicago. At the time, HIV/AIDS was the #1 cause of death for Black women aged 25 to 34 years. And while Black women comprised 37% of Chicago's female population, they accounted for 80% of female diagnoses. So by exploring a range of domains such as social support, economic survival, childbearing, child rearing, intimate relationships, Sister to Sister sought to illustrate some of the ways in which HIV impacted the women's everyday lives, life chances, and social outcomes. So my research assistant and I, and you'll see what we did, recruited women to speak with us through physicians, social service agencies, and word of mouth. We conducted at least 3 interactions with each participant, 2 interviews and 1 observation session in which we accompanied each respondent to a site where her HIV status was known and salient. So we attended doctor's appointments and support group meetings. We sat in the audience during speaking engagements when women told their stories. We visited them in their homes and were among the first visitors after the births of their children. So while analysis in my book that I'm working on is drawn from all of the Sister to Sister participants, today I want to take you into the life of one woman in depth in order to map out what I'm calling the transformative project. And I chose to focus on her story because it's illustrative of many of the stories that we heard from Sister to Sister women. Just to give you a quick context on the larger project, we also conducted a snapshot interview study. Here we were interested in recruiting a larger group of women living with HIV, women of diverse racial, economic, and class backgrounds. We conducted those interviews from the main portion of those interviews from 2010 to 2012. We were really interested in socioeconomic diversity among the women, trying to determine if the arguments that we were parsing out in the Sister to Sister study had validity as we thought about a more racially, economically diverse group of women. We were also interested in testing out this notion of institutional connection, and I'm going to talk a lot about that in the talk today. And we wanted to also have some variation on the basis of primary income source, how women were making ends meet, because the larger study is about social survival, but as you're going to see, social survival and economic survival and physical survival are inextricably linked. So we were interested in all of that. And our goal was to get a broad overview of the economic picture of women living with HIV in Chicago and to understand how that influences a range of social dynamics and also health outcomes. We also interviewed AIDS service providers, individuals who were on the front lines of service delivery, to try to understand how the AIDS safety net, as I call it, has transformed in the last several years to make sure that people are able to live with HIV as a chronic and manageable illness. So my talk is going to proceed in 3 parts. First, I want to use the case of a woman named Dawn to examine what a transformative project looks like in depth. In part 2, I want to discuss the infrastructure, the AIDS safety net that facilitated Dawn's transformation and the transformations of several other women in the study. In Q&A, I'm happy to talk about how this connects to how we understand traditional safety nets, our social welfare system. And then in part 3, I want to propose a conceptual framework that I'm calling the transformative project. And my ultimate goal in this research is to identify the policy, institutional, and conceptual tools that propel the movement of individuals from extreme social, economic, and physical distress and hardship to one of overall improved well-being. So importantly, what you'll see is this is not a story about upward mobility, a well-trodden area in sociology and other disciplines as we listen to Dawn's story. We'll meet women in my work and today with Dawn who, by and large, do not experience major leaps in socioeconomic status. But what they do experience is noteworthy, I'm arguing. It's a shift from a near physical and social death to life in which they are much more stable and better positioned to confront structural barriers in their paths. So I'm really trying to recognize the agency of social actors grappling with stigmatizing conditions. I'm trying to highlight and account for dynamic and significant change in the lives of stigmatized individuals. I want to disrupt this narrative of kind of the static actor in the urban poverty landscape. We think of the individual as once this, always this, and I want to kind of interrupt that narrative to really have us think about this in terms of a life course perspective. And I want to offer an analysis of the infrastructure that bolsters and undermines these transformations. So let's meet Dawn. Dawn Stevens grew up in a working class neighborhood on Chicago's West Side in the 1970s and 1980s that was precariously situated around several high poverty areas. Her transition to adulthood occurred at a time of massive structural shifts in neighborhoods like hers. De facto racial and economic residential segregation and the lack of investment on the part of government and private businesses limited paths for upward mobility for residents, including young adults. With the increasing availability of illegal drugs, the drug trade offered Dawn and many in her cohort seemingly fast money and easy emotional escapes from the blight that surrounded them. With rising intra-community violence, declining funding for health and other community services, and a mass incarceration boom that began to aggressively warehouse friends, family members, and neighbors, the barrier between life and death was becoming increasingly porous for young people like Dawn. When the sexual trauma of Dawn's childhood collided with the structural blows and deteriorating safety net confronting her community, the effects were combustible. The first instances of molestation took place when she was just 5 years old and would continue off and on until she was 16 at the hands of 2 different family members, including her stepfather. My village wasn't safe, Dawn tearfully recalled. She told no one about the sexual abuse, convinced that her mother wouldn't believe her and her biological father would retaliate violently against the perpetrators and she would lose him to prison. But she acted out in other ways. She snuck sips of her father's drinks at house parties and began smoking marijuana and cigarettes in the 8th grade. By her sophomore year of high school, she was drinking regularly. By the time she was a 16-year-old junior in high school, her rebellion intensified, tensions with both her parents escalated, and she ran away from home, in part to escape the increasingly aggressive advances of her stepfather. I had been sexually molested for years, so when I left home, I was crazy, Dawn reflected. She moved in for a few weeks with the person she idolized the most, her 19-year-old stepsister, Jackie. Jackie had already graduated to the fast life, shooting drugs intravenously and dating the neighborhood dealers who maintained her supply. When those relationships dried up, Jackie began to turn dates, selling sex for money and drugs. Dawn followed suit, learning how to inject drugs intravenously by observing Jackie and trading sex for drugs with the guys with whom she partied. Her habits became a source of deep disappointment and sadness for her family, who knew nothing about the molestation. Their lack of awareness fueled Dawn's sense of anger and betrayal, and she continued to distance herself. The environmental and personal turmoil in Dawn's life was occurring at the exact historical moment in which the AIDS epidemic was gaining an early and strong foothold in Black communities, quietly taking up residence in structurally compromised neighborhoods and networks and weaving itself into the epidemiological fabric. As we know from Kathy Cohen's work from its early stages, the epidemic had a disproportionate impact on Black communities, and it would be years before the threat was fully understood. Singer and others have developed the concept of syndemics to prevent the overlapping and mutually reinforcing epidemics of substance abuse, violence, and HIV that arise under conditions of severe health and social disparities. And we know from previous research the prevention and treatment services, particularly in Black communities, were laggard in terms of the response. With a growing syndemic in her backyard, Dawn was diagnosed HIV positive the first time in 1985. The epidemic was still in its early stages when the amount of information was limited and medical providers had few plans and protocols in place to guide the newly diagnosed. She left the hospital where she was informed about her illness with little understanding of what it meant. Dawn's drug use escalated and it did not go unnoticed. Having recently come to terms with her sexuality, her first serious girlfriend asked Dawn to leave their shared apartment and insisted that Dawn's 6-month-old daughter, China, remain in Dawn's care. Dawn agreed, knowing that she was in a deep spiral. This would be Dawn's 3rd child to leave her custody. Several years prior, her grandmother, exasperated by Dawn's hard partying ways, demanded that the son Dawn give birth to at 17 live with her. A second son was born 3 years later in 1981, and Dawn's first cousin raised him. In 1991, yet another daughter was born and immediately taken by the foster care system. Frustrated and fed up, her family stopped speaking to her, beginning a silence that would last for 16 years. After exhausting all of her invitations to sleep on the couches of various family members and friends, Dawn ended up on the streets a few years after her 1985 diagnosis. Abandoned buildings and hallways became temporary homes, and jail served as Dawn's way station when she needed a break from the streets. She was an active trader in a drug and sex market that was patronized by individuals of every race and class from the city to the suburbs, but located squarely in the poor black neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago that Dawn called home. There were a lot of white guys who came through, Dawn recalled, and a lot of them were looking for dates and to get high. Encounters with men who wanted to buy both sex and drugs from her were especially lucrative. For years, Dawn lived in a hamster wheel of drug use and sex work, incarceration, and sometimes sincere and sometimes half-hearted attempts at avoiding drugs. Her moves in and out of sobriety were motivated by a desire to stay clean, but the emotional scars of childhood sexual trauma could only be papered over for so long before the pain required numbing. In the absence of other tools, the drug marketplaces in the neighborhoods that she frequented offered an escape, but one that was obviously detrimental to her health. In 1992, several years after her initial diagnosis, Dawn was arrested for knifing a customer who attempted to sexually assault her. Instead of one of her relatively short stints in the Cook County Jail, she was sent to prison, where she was diagnosed HIV positive for the second time. In the penitentiary, when I went in, they asked me, "Have you ever had TB?" "I've had TB." And she goes, "Well, we've got to test you for TB." I'm like, "Okay." And I didn't register that I already had this test. I didn't know what HIV was, what it meant to be HIV positive. So when they called me back to the healthcare facility, she goes, "Miss Stevens, you have HIV." I'm like, "Okay." And she goes, "Is there anything that you need?" "No." And again, that was the end of it. There was no explanation. I still didn't know any more than I did the first time I got tested. So now 2 tests with no information. Dawn served her time, aware of her status, but unaware of the seriousness of the situation. She told no one inside the jail. "I didn't know what to tell anybody," she commented. Upon her release 3 years later, she entered an HIV education program offered by the county, the completion of which was a requirement for visitation with China, who is now living with a family in foster care after Dawn's ex-girlfriend passed. A whopping 10 years after her first HIV diagnosis, the county program served as Dawn's first substantive orientation to her condition. By this time, AIDS deaths in the United States were at an all-time high. The program kick-started the moment in which Dawn began to grapple with the meaning and significance of her diagnosis. The program facilitators informed Dawn about the practical implications of living with HIV. They told me that I was going to have it for the rest of my life, that there were things that I had to do, such as start sleeping again. I needed to take better care of myself. Dawn knew this would be easier said than done, given her circumstances. Homeless, estranged from family, struggling with substance abuse, and embedded in a world of criminal activity with few opportunities for second chances, just living, let alone living with HIV, would be a feat. Dawn stayed clean for stretches, securing a spot in a transitional housing facility run by Catholic nuns, regaining custody of China, and celebrating almost 2 years of sobriety. But she struggled to fully escape the uncompromising grip of the drugs. She started using again, pawning everything she owned to support her habit. She lost her job at a small nonprofit, her apartment, and custody of her daughter in a span of 6 months. China, Dawn explained, was smart enough at 12 to tell a teacher that I was using, so Child Protective Services came and got her. Dawn's health suffered tremendously as she returned to life on the streets. Contrary to the advice that she received in the county program, she didn't prioritize her health. She barely slept. In addiction, nobody thinks about health. When you don't feel good, you get high and you feel better. The depression comes when you're coming off the drugs, so you take another hit and you feel better. She became a frequent participant in the emergency room with fevers and opportunistic infections. An ER doctor convinced her to try AZT, one of the first medications to be widely used for people living with HIV. I spent my entire life in the bathroom and nauseated. I decided no more medication. I got back into my addictions. My viral load shot up, my T helper cells went down. At one point, the amount of HIV virus in her body was so high that she was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. It was Dawn's 1999 stint in a housing facility for women struggling with both HIV and drug and alcohol addiction called St. Mary's that began to turn things around for her. At 38, remember she was diagnosed at 24, Dawn knew that she was in desperate need for another chance to change course. I wanted to do something different. Drugs were flowing freely in the neighborhood when I started getting high. At some point, they stopped flowing as freely, and I had to get out and hustle for them. And that got old. I guess if I had not had the mindset to want to do better, I'd probably either be dead or still locked there in my addiction. Because there's a lot of women who couldn't handle the frustration or the pressure that being in a sober environment 24/7 would put on them, and they would just disappear. So you definitely have to have your mind made up. She took her time, staying at St. Mary's for 2 whole years to make sure that she was strong enough to make it in the world without numbing herself with drugs. She began systematically gathering the tools that she would need to change her life's course. She finally absorbed and accepted the incompatibility between her drug and alcohol abuse and the management of her HIV, and got clean. I realized that doing drugs were killing my body more than HIV. I decided I didn't want to die. I didn't want HIV to take me out, so I had to stop getting high. Further radical changes would be necessary. Dawn became a proactive advocate for her health, approaching the healthcare system with a very different mindset and approach. I paid my physician a visit. I did my research and had this list of unacceptable HIV medications, those that folks were saying were the most toxic. It just so happened that my doctor and I were on the same page. She recommended the same medications that I was thinking about trying out, so that was a good beginning for us because she had just become my doctor. Her stay at St. Mary's gleaned another positive effect. Dawn met a woman who was also in residence there, dealing with the same demons of drug abuse. Meeting at a transitional facility for women living with HIV also eliminated the challenging work of disclosure about HIV status. I guess my mind told me that it was time to actually look for a long-term relationship, Dawn explained. I wanted to stop doing things the way I used to do them. When Dawn enrolled in 2005 in the research study that's at the center of this book, just 6 years, of the book that I'm writing, just 6 years from living on the streets, the distance between her former and her new life was vast. Up most days at 6:30 a.m., Dawn's family and her extensive work in the AIDS advocacy community occupied the center of her focus. Dawn and Deanna moved out of St. Mary's in 2001 and remained in a deep and loving partnership, 2 souls who have each other for support as they create new ways of being in the world. In the throes of addiction, Dawn's 4 children were taken away one by one. When we met her, she and Deanna were now the trusted caretakers of a 4-year-old girl named Daisy, whose teenage mother asked Dawn and Deanna to care for the girl from the time the baby was 6 months old. I did the potty training. I got her out of diapers, the shots, the doctor's visits. We read together. Deanna likes to let Daisy help her cook. When we got her, she was rocking and pulling her hair out. She's now stable now, mentally, physically, emotionally. Dawn's personal story also led to her political work. For more than a decade, she's been a prominent voice in the HIV community, a trusted leader. She's traveled the country speaking with groups about HIV prevention, met with politicians, including Nancy Pelosi, to advocate for increased funding for AIDS programs and services, and served on the boards of some of the most prominent national and local AIDS organizations. I think my real work comes from being an activist, she commented. The only risky behavior that I do now is telling a politician what I really think of him. As her political engagement built her confidence and network, Dawn parlayed her volunteer work into paid employment in various human service organizations in the city, dealing with issues ranging from domestic violence to homelessness to HIV. She's worked as the assistant director of a small housing program, a case manager, and a personal assistant to people living with HIV. Over the course of 10 years, my research assistants and I would come to interview Dawn more than 6 times, tracing the physical, social, economic, and political transformation of her life. When we met, her long graying dreadlocks reflected a 20-year journey with HIV, evolving into a 30-year journey by the time we conducted our last interviews with her in 2015. Daisy, now 14, is thriving in Dawn's care. 16 years free of alcohol and illegal drugs at this writing, Dawn still bears the scars of her previous life, walking with a cane and struggling with a variety of old injuries incurred on the streets. But with a viral load that is undetectable, the presence of the HIV virus is minimal in her bloodstream, held in check with only 1 prescribed pill that Dawn takes daily, a far cry from her once 25-pill-a-day regimen. Since the turning point that she experienced at St. Mary's, Dawn has embarked upon an extensive process of learning how to live with HIV, reluctantly but successfully finding a place for it in the fabric of her life. During one of my conversations with her, Dawn offered the challenging assessment that I offered earlier. If it were not for HIV, I'd probably be dead right now because I never would have stopped getting high. This admission may sound shocking, obvious fodder for those who seek to further stigmatize HIV-positive women with histories of substance abuse, to use Dawn's words as a justification for apathy towards the epidemic or the deployment of punitive tactics of social control for women like her. It's a deeply ironic statement as well. How can a life-threatening illness responsible for the deaths of millions around the world actually help prevent a death? Addiction, with its roots in Dawn's history of childhood sexual abuse, was shaping every aspect of her life, from her tools of economic survival on the streets, to her residential choices, to how she formulated, sustained, and damaged relationships with friends, family, and intimate partners. And her broader environment, depleted of many opportunities and resources, also had substantial obstacles that elicited a variety of coping and survival strategies that were destroying Dawn's health. Changing that operating system, her mode of navigating the tremendous inequalities around her, would demand intense work on her part. HIV would require her to manage her health differently, but addressing the diagnosis would also demand that she find new ways to navigate the economic and social hurdles that had previously hobbled her. HIV rendered her prior coping and survival strategies untenable if she had any hope of staying alive. Acknowledging her past, Dawn nevertheless chose to create a future for herself by living another kind of life. So how do women remake, not simply rebuild, their lives after traumas associated with social and economic disadvantage? How do women go from dying from to living with HIV? Rebuilding suggests a return to a prior state, but remaking is much more dramatic. It's transformational. We often think of significant life conversions as highly personal and individual experiences, perhaps even spiritual in makeup. But I argue that life transformations are in fact deeply social events, negotiated processes influenced by the people, places, and policies that we encounter. The companion story to Dawn's remarkable life transformation, because it's easy to just focus on Dawn, but the companion story is the remarkable transformation over the same 3+ decades of the epidemic that threatened her life. The extraordinary conversion of HIV/AIDS from an inevitable death sentence to a manageable chronic illness in well-resourced countries like the United States is not only one of the most significant medical achievements of the past 35 years, it's also one of our most significant social achievements, I would argue. Activist institutions were on the front lines, driving the medical community and government to invest significant dollars in research and shaping a public dialogue that increased awareness and pushed AIDS to a high perch on the list of societal concerns during some of the epidemic's most destructive periods. While AIDS activism arguably privileged the needs, experiences, and struggles of white middle-class gay men, women living with HIV have also been active participants in AIDS mobilization, using their stigmatized identities as a source of political and self-empowerment and advocating for a more inclusive approach to fighting the epidemic. Perhaps one of the most important and undercredited and under-theorized outcomes of AIDS mobilization is the emergence of an extensive HIV/AIDS support infrastructure, what I'm calling the AIDS safety net. This is a network made up of AIDS, human service providers, advocacy organizations, the social security system, healthcare providers, and the substance abuse recovery community. In previous work, LaShonda Pittman, Jean Beeman, and I introduced a concept called framing institutions. We argue that framing institutions help HIV-positive women move from physical and social death to life by offering critical information about their HIV status, language to talk about their condition, resources and networks to begin restructuring their lives post-diagnosis. And these framing institutions, often invisible to those not reliant on them, points to a potential avenue through which severe economic and social disadvantages can begin to be ameliorated. In Dawn's case, it wasn't the HIV diagnosis per se that sparked the change of course that we heard about today. Along with the medical and pharmacological discoveries that evolved over the decades since her initial diagnosis, a safety net emerged that offered Dawn new strategies to confront the deadly triad of sexual abuse, poverty, and HIV that illegal drugs were proving ineffective at ameliorating. Perhaps the deadly risk of AIDS created the final spark of urgency, but it was the institutional infrastructure that supported the change. As an institutional broker, St. Mary's provided a roof over Dawn's head as she embarked on her transformative project and reconstituted the pieces of her life. St. Mary's also connected her with a network of AIDS service providers that would help Dawn physically survive by introducing her to a network of physicians who perfected her HIV care regimen and addressed a myriad of other physical issues she was navigating, economically survive by assigning a case manager who helped her gain access to financial resources, and socially survive by connecting her to HIV support groups. They helped her in terms of her physical health, her economic health, and her social support network. Those relationships then facilitated her entree into the city's AIDS activist and advocate network, which led to a measure of political influence and economic opportunities. So as we go deeper into analyzing Dawn's transformative project, we see her continued movement. We start at the top with injuries of inequality, which I laid out in detail in terms of what she was grappling with. We see her continued movement away from survival and coping strategies that she was previously using to numb inequalities injuries to something different. We see a clear relationship between, first, the cognitive shift that determined for Dawn that something had to change. And this is where often in our political debate we stop talking, right? It just becomes about Dawn making the change in her mind that she's gonna live differently. But the cycle, the narrative and the process doesn't end there. Next, we need an institutional safety net, a set of institutional relationships that support and anchor that cognitive shift. And then, third, the importance of a new modus operandi that sustains the movement from death to life. All three of these are necessary conditions, I would argue, for the transformative project to occur. So the groundwork laid by framing institutions that articulated to Dawn what it would mean to live with HIV was sustained over time as Dawn and Deanna reformulated their identities, had experiences that validated their new roles, and continued to have access to opportunities and resources to solidify their new survival strategies. One of their first decisions upon leaving St. Mary's was choosing where they would live. They received a voucher for subsidized housing in a lottery run by a local AIDS organization in 2001, who renewed the assistance for more than a decade, reducing their rent in 2015 from $750 a month to an affordable $375 a month. Traversing the city once settled in their new apartment was made possible by packs of free bus cards given to the couple by Dawn's case manager at St. Mary's, increasing the ease with which Dawn and Deanna could make doctor's appointments, attend support group meetings, and get groceries for the house. Once the issue of long-term housing was settled, Dawn was able to adopt additional strategies to manage her health. She was able to begin therapy and grapple with the demons of childhood sexual abuse and the violence that she had experienced. Dean and Deanna next had to fashion a new set of economic strategies in order to survive, ones that did not put their lives at risk. Because of her tremendous health challenges, Dawn qualified for Social Security. We heard about Dawn's work experience in various nonprofits. They also leveraged their experiential capital, using the knowledge and wisdom derived from their traumatic events to lend a voice in the AIDS advocacy community, generating speaking engagements and volunteering in research studies, a strategy that has implications that we can talk about in Q&A. So to be sure, Dawn and her family, and Dawn herself describes her family as barely above the federal poverty level, and things certainly aren't easy. So there's still important work to do. But nevertheless, Dawn's new financial operating system offered more physical safety and a fundamental approach to handling, economic stress. So that's why I emphasize that the mobility that we observe here isn't always going to be about socioeconomic mobility, gains in education, income, and wealth. That's how we sociologists typically count legitimate mobility to be. Critically important, right? But not the end of the story. Rather, mobility that Dawn is experiencing is really a transition from dying from to living with. And yes, perhaps some improvement in social standing, but most importantly, improvements in the basic level of health and well-being in terms of housing, income, physical and psychological health, and socially supportive relationships. And if there's an area of her life where the transformative project has had its limits, it's in her relationship with her biological children. And I can talk about how she has worked to kind of reconnect with them and the role that they're playing in her life. So one of the important things as we think about this notion of remaking a life as I move to close is how do we theorize this, right? How do we move from this case? And by the way, there are many cases like Dawn's in the work that we've been doing, but how do we begin to theorize around it, and how can we speak to policymakers around what it is that's happening here that we think is important? So by analyzing the lives of stigmatized women as they grapple with their past and present while creating a future, my book advances what I call the transformative project. I define the transformative project as a multidimensional process by which individuals fundamentally shift how they conceptualize, strategize around, and tactically address struggles related to the complex inequalities that affect their everyday lives. It entails the adoption of a radically different set of approaches to negotiate questions of physical, social, economic, and political survival, concerns that are at the center of a life of intersectional disadvantage. Remaking a Life, or the Transformative Project, goes beyond stress-related growth by integrating newfound physical, social, and economic and survival and mobility strategies to improve overall well-being after one has been confronted with some of the harsh, direct, and indirect effects of racism, poverty, sexism, and homophobia. It involves altering the ways in which one engages with engages in micro-level interpersonal interaction, with meso-level institutions and neighborhoods, and even with macro-structural arrangements such as policy. And as we saw through Dawn's story, there was ways in which she shifted how she interacted on all of those different levels: micro-interactions, institutions, and then with public policy as she became a political actor. More dynamic than resilience or coping, transformative agency represents women's distinct and deliberate moves from what was to what can be. Therefore, under certain conditions, the transformative project can produce significant changes to the trajectory of one's life. At its core, the transformative project is not about personal transformation as an end in and of itself, what we commonly think of as self-help. It's not about fixing alleged deficiencies, nor is the transformative project a repackaged elixir of personal responsibility, reducible to the bootstrap climbs of American lore. Rather, the transformative project is about the integration of agency, or to be more specific, transformative agency, with the environmental networks, the institutions, and policies that support women's efforts. By charting that process, including the resources at women's disposal and the barriers that they confront, my work explicitly challenges the highly individualistic personal responsibility frame that is dominant in discourse around both HIV and social and economic disadvantage. As such, a discussion of women's transformative agency should never be decoupled from the social, political, and economic conditions that they seek to escape or alter. So it's important to note what the transformative project is not and what it's unable to do. Its deployment does not suggest that the challenges in women's lives can be eliminated or reduced solely to the power of positive thinking. There is hard work involved to test out and struggle with the new strategies, and you saw Dawn's story of ebb and flow. It wasn't a linear story. By no means is the process often is rapid or linear. Rather, it's best characterized by fits and starts, periods of marked improvement followed by crushing setbacks. Women's progress in transforming their lives does not inoculate them from the punishing health, economic, and social hurdles that continue to confront them, and that I know all of us in this room are thinking about studying and advocating around. So regardless of their agency, the women in the study are still living with a very serious health issue that can end their lives if not appropriately managed. They still confront massive structural barriers that need to be attacked, which is why in this conceptual rendering, I show how the women's long-term status change still confronts injuries of inequality. So as you look at the Remade Life and their new operating strategy, nevertheless, they still confront injuries of inequality. As a result, however, they're able to do this with new survival and coping strategies. Part of this transformative project is kind of learning this process of how to navigate things differently. As a result, some of the women that we spoke to were never able to move beyond the shock of diagnosis and other traumas to launch a successful transformative project. And in those cases, I believe that what explains the variation is that some aspect of the process, the conceptual shift, the relationships with framing institutions, the longer term change in status from death to life has yet to coalesce in some way. The support hasn't been there. As I conclude, my work seeks to raise a universal question. How do human beings remake their lives after individual and/or structural trauma? And what conditions best support these efforts? For the women in my work, their HIV status provided access to a safety net that enabled significant and sustained change. And this is a sobering reality. It suggests that our societal safety net has been perversely shaped to intervene only when citizens are already deeply injured, rather than playing a more preventative role, as the primary category of eligibility is not need, but a serious and perhaps deadly health threat. The fire must be raging before we install the fire extinguisher. At the same time, the HIV safety net, the AIDS safety net, pushed by the strong mobilization of activists, deserves a significant amount of credit for building this infrastructure and transforming this epidemic. In partnership with the medical and pharmacological advances around HIV prevention and treatment, it offers support to for women to address their HIV diagnosis alongside other survival concerns. In these early days of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and our continued discussions around inequality and its injuries, the supports offered to women in my research who embark upon transformative projects provide a model for how we might think about assisting a broader number of individuals suffering severe injuries of inequality, not just those who are living with HIV. Thank you. Yeah, why don't we sit? Partly because I am so short and, I feel so bad for the people who probably couldn't see me.
So before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to take about 5 to 10 minutes just to have a conversation with Dr. Watton-Hayes. So first of all, thank you so much for a very incredibly informative and inspiring talk on the dynamic social conditions that give rise to transformative agency and institutional change among HIV-positive women in Chicago. For those of us who work in this area, HIV/AIDS, we tend to think of it as quite unique, even though it's really not. It often characterizes critical ruptures in personal and social relations. It also brings to the forefront huge inequitable suffering among certain groups of people, as well as highlight the deep embedded nature of social, economic, and healthcare inequities and the differential relations of power that we have in our society. HIV and AIDS can also be seen as an incredibly transformative point in our global history. It brings about new dynamics between biology, rights-based politics, and identity in ways that we've never considered before. So I want to engage with you on so many different points because I get really excited about this kind of work. But in the interest of time, I want to really focus on 2 things that really intersect with my own work with Haitian and African American women living with HIV and AIDS. So the first is about the notion of this great phrase that you had about intersectional disadvantage, and wondering about how transformative agency perhaps works through or departs from raising consciousness on the dynamics and operations of gendered, class, and racial power, and how are these types of relations of power actively negotiated. Second, a few years ago, policymakers, donors, and researchers began declaring that an end of AIDS was not only a goal in our efforts to control the epidemic, but a vision of a very realistic future. To this end, biomedical technologies such as PrEP, pre-exposure for prophylaxis, and treatment as prevention have been promoted as the main way we can get to zero and achieve an AIDS-free generation. These technologies were coupled with an uncertain economic situation, a global one, where funding for treatment was dwindling, both in the United States and globally. In this rapid shifting political and economic terrain, there's also been a departure from a commitment to universal lifelong treatment to the embrace of these technologies upon which an end to AIDS was premised. I'm wondering what these systematic shifts mean for women in Chicago, in Miami, in Prince George's County, and other places, and the types of opportunities which arise from these new dynamic changes occurring within a system where these women are seeking to transform themselves.
Thank you so much for these questions. So for those in the audience, what Thurka is highlighting is we are at a critical point as it relates to the epidemic. Particularly, and I'll talk about specifically the U.S. context, and we can talk about global if there's time. But in the U.S. context, there's always been a tension between kind of the biomedical approach of what kinds of medications, drugs can we create that will end the epidemic versus some of the structural, the kind of social determinants arguments of, we know that HIV disproportionately affects particular populations. We know some of the drivers and dynamics around that. Let's attack the drivers and the dynamics around that. So what's happened is this kind of hybrid system has been created where both ends of the spectrum have been addressed or are being addressed. The biomedical approach has been extremely successful to the point that we are looking at the possibility of the end of AIDS because of its treatability. So the notion that you can take a pill to prevent infection, but you can also, if you find yourself infected living with HIV, the medications are such that, we talked about Dawn taking 1 pill a day. Some of our respondents are not taking any medication right now, and their viral load is still suppressed to the point that the amount of HIV is pretty minimal in their system because of medications they've taken in the past and their ability to take care of themselves and monitor their blood work. So there's a way in which the kind of end of AIDS is upon us. But I would argue that that is not going to be successful unless we continue to address the structural determinants, because the biomedical approach assumes that people are going to take the pills. It assumes that people are going to take the pills consistently, assumes that people are going to have access to the pills. So our kind of social determinant argument is still absolutely critical and works in tandem with the biomedical approach. And what I'm advocating for, and what I hope my research shows, is the importance of those things working in tandem, right? So it wasn't just about Dawn getting access to the pills. It was also about addressing all of these other challenges that she was confronting that were challenging her ability to take care of herself on a day-to-day basis. The economic piece, housing, where is she working, staying clean, except the drug and alcohol issues. So what I'm arguing is that we tout the success of the AIDS epidemic in terms of the biomedical approach, but we should also be touting the success of the infrastructure that AIDS built, is what I call it. And while we were, and I'm a poverty researcher by training, so while I was writing a book on the decline of the welfare system and the transformation of the welfare system, the AIDS community was steadily building up an infrastructure before our very eyes that people were not paying attention to. Fighting for access to Social Security, fighting for human services, fighting for housing for people living with HIV, fighting for non-stigmatizing services. So not only were they providing the services, but they were creating an ethos around care, right? And that's not to say it was perfect. There's all kinds of tensions on the basis of race, class, sexuality in terms of the diversity of people who are living with HIV and who got more access than others, and we can talk about that. But nevertheless, an infrastructure was built that I'm arguing gives us really, really important lessons to understand how we can think about a broader array of individuals suffering these disproportionate injuries of inequality who are struggling to figure out how do they move in a direction of transformation, not in the personal responsibility sense, but in a way of identifying new strategies and tactics to navigate these very severe injuries. So when we're talking about people moving out of incarceration, when we're talking about people moving from drug and alcohol histories, when we're talking about all of the different ways in which people have been in severe distress as a result of the injuries of inequality, how do they transform their operating system so that they can navigate these inequalities? And we're going to talk today about, let's address the inequalities too, obviously. That can't be a point that can be missed. But what I worry about with this end of AIDS discourse is, let's just focus on the biomedical and let's get everybody on the pills. Let's just get everybody taking the pills. And the challenge with that, as we see from Dawn's story, is just getting Dawn to take the pills was a fraction of what she was navigating. And we've known that, but what I hope that my work illuminates is very systematically how an infrastructure was put in place and how an infrastructure supported her through that transition. As it relates to your first question around intersectional disadvantage, the other thing that's really interesting about the AIDS infrastructure is how it dealt with and negotiated intersectional disadvantage. So, we know that there wasn't the focus on the epidemic among people of color that there should have been in the early years, and that there was a lot of pushback around that. I think that we've seen a shift in the last several decades where it's a much more inclusive approach, but there's also an ethos around it that I think is really interesting in terms of a much less surveillance-based system of support, right? So it's about surveillance of the blood work, but it's not necessarily about surveillance of every other aspect of your life, which is in some ways where we are with the poverty safety net. It's about peer-based and peer-led care, so finding ways that Dawn herself can not just be a client, but can be a participant and a service provider herself within this community. I think that offers an important lesson for us. So through those, I think that people find ways to challenge those intersectional disadvantages because they're armed with the tools, right? They learn the politics, they learn the networks, they learn the systems so that they can speak out for themselves and that they can participate and be in some of the rooms where these conversations are taking place. Coming from a place where I studied the lives of low-income women who are navigating the welfare system, that wasn't an ethos and that wasn't something that was afforded to people, where you have peer-led support, where people can become clients but also advocates and service providers themselves in quite the same kind of way. So I think that, you know, when I think of somebody like Michelle Tracy Berger's book, Workable Sisterhood, and the ways in which this kind of participation gives way to a politics that challenges those intersectional disadvantages, I think there's some very important lessons here that I think are portable to and may be portable in other contexts. But the challenge has been the public health community and the inequality community. We've been having some of the same conversations, but not necessarily having a holistic view of safety nets and how they're working in various contexts.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move right along and continue these conversations once all of our panelists go through. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. David Che, who's an assistant professor of epidemiology and biostatistics at the University of Maryland. Dr. Che is a social epidemiologist who studies health disparities and the implications of stressors experienced by minority populations. A particular focus of his research is on discrimination, a qualitatively unique form of psychosocial stress that has been associated with poor mental health, harmful health behaviors, and indicators of chronic risk of disease. So welcome, Dr. Che.
Thanks so much for that lovely talk, by the way, which I think really emphasizes the need to pay attention to the social determinants of health. And well, this observation that social factors really play a profound role in the life and death of people is really not something new, though. This is a quote by Rudolph Virchow, one of the early pioneers of the field of public health. Medical statistics will be our standard of measurement. We will weigh life for life and see where the dead lie thicker, among the workers or among the privileged. So there's a few things that I like about this quote. One is that it calls attention to systematic disparities between disadvantaged and advantaged groups. Another is that it really highlights this idea of equality, that we will weigh life for life, that no life is worth more than another, and that yes, Black lives matter too. Also implicit is an emphasis on the need to measure and monitor not only health outcomes, but also the underlying social factors that drive health disparities. And racial disparities, in particular, are closely linked to various facets of racism. But how do we measure racism? Well, we conducted a study looking at whether the extent of racism in a particular geographic area might be associated with health outcomes. The tricky thing, though, is that it's really hard to quantify how racist an area is. So we utilized a proxy that might reflect racial attitudes, and that was the proportion of Google searches containing the N-word. And that's the N-word ending in ER or ERS, not in A or AS. And research has found that when aggregating millions and millions of internet searches across multiple years of data, this measure provides a pretty good signal of the relative level of racism in a particular geographic area despite various sources of noise. So this map shows the distribution of those searches, with those areas in red and orange reflecting higher proportions of Google searches containing the N-word. And what we found was that area racism, as indexed by this Google measure, was strongly associated with the Black all-cause mortality rate. Each standard deviation increase in area racism was associated with an 8.2% increase in the Black all-cause mortality rate. And this effect estimate is not trivial. It's equivalent to about 30,000 excess Black deaths per year. And this relationship remains significant even after controlling for other area level demographic and socioeconomic factors, as well as when controlling for the white mortality rate in those areas. So why is it that this association exists? Well, obvious examples are through violent civil rights abuses, hate crimes, police brutality. These violent expressions of racism are the most apparent and visible ways that racism negatively impacts health. But the effects of racism go beyond these overt forms, and the biggest effects of racism on our health are more covert. Racism is much like environmental toxin. It's a social toxin that's ambient. It gets under our skin whether we're aware of it or not, whether we see it or not. So racism is literally embodied by negatively impacting our biology, and its effects accumulate over time. And one way that this might manifest is through the length of our telomeres. And telomeres have been posited to be an indicator of our biological or cellular age. Telomeres are repetitive sequences of DNA that cap the ends of our chromosomes, shown here in yellow. And telomeres generally shorten over time, but they've been shown to undergo more rapid shortening under conditions of high social stress. In this sense, the cumulative effects of racism may show up in the lengths of our telomeres. And what we found in our research on African American men specifically was that those who reported experiencing high levels of racial discrimination had signs of accelerated cellular aging as indexed by telomere length, but only among those who had internalized an anti-Black bias. And the difference here between those reporting low and high levels of racial discrimination is equivalent to about 3 years of chronologic age. So I think this points to how multiple facets of racism operate jointly to deteriorate our health. In closing, I think the effects of racism on our health are observable across different levels of analysis, from looking at the broader population level distribution of mortality down to the molecular and cellular level. Thank you.
Next, I welcome Dr. Fernando Rivera, who's Associate Professor and Associate Chair of the Department of Sociology. His work focuses on the sociology of health and medical sociology, disasters, and race and ethnicity. In the area of health, his published work has investigated how different mechanisms are related to certain health and mental health outcomes, with a particular emphasis on Latino populations.
Right. How's everybody doing? We're hanging on? Okay, good. So good morning. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers and everybody here. I felt honored and humble to be here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done, and particularly have some Latino and Latina health reflections of some of the issues that are going on in terms of the health outcomes. And, kind of like tying everything that we talked about today, kind of like this issue, the issues of injuries and of inequality, and for me, sort of establishing sort of the connection between racism and health outcomes. And if you look at it, for me, as a sociologist, is sort of this idea that we have these policies, we have these systems that basically negate people access to socially valued resources. And we're talking, and this is just an example of those, not necessarily inclusive of those, but when you don't have access to quality education, sources of income, decent housing, safety, food, all those sort of issues that we have a lot of evidence that suggests that this is related to better health outcomes. So for the get-go, I wanted to sort of give you a sense of, what is sort of my view of these structural issues out here that we have. One of the things in my research and what I've tried to do throughout my career is looking at these variations among Latino groups. We tend to lump them together, and this is even the label of Latino is sort of a social construction base here. So from my experience, I had to learn how to be Latino because I'm from Puerto Rico. There's no Latinos in Puerto Rico. And all of a sudden, you have to learn to deal with these constructs that usually are negatively related to your health as well. So we have an interesting case. So lately I've done a lot of research looking at Latino subgroup differences. Why is it that Cubans seem to have the best health outcomes, while at the very end we have Puerto Ricans with the worst health outcomes? And I'm not going to give you an extensive lecture out here of the ideas, but when we think about Cubans in the context of reception after, and I don't want to generalize because there's been a lot of ways of Cubans migrants out here, but there was a different context of reception. It was an acceptable context of reception, not sort of the dynamic that we're having about Mexicans and building the wall and all these negative sort of connotations that we have right now. We have, evidence that Mexicans do bring about, Mexican immigrants in the first years in the United States do bring about this Hispanic health paradox, and their health indicators seem to suggest that they have better indicators, but eventually, that goes away. For Puerto Ricans, we don't have that. Kind of like this paradox have been a little bit lost. And when you think about this, and I looked at some of the numbers in terms of the diseases that we have, both in the island of Puerto Rico and both here in the mainland, you see that, not necessarily the best health outcomes that we can imagine. So from some of the stuff that I've done, usually I started out looking at, it's acculturation to U.S., a positive thing or a negative thing, but it seems that as you acculturate, you get more emphasis on how well you don't fit into society, and that elevates your depressive symptoms. I've looked at some of these issues of the intersectionality that we were talking about. So, what it's like to be a white Latino versus a black Latino. And when we look at those issues, so those relationships are a little bit steeper in terms of this idea of depression as well. And again, I'm going to focus in my brief remarks out here what's going on in Puerto Rico, which is sort of a humanitarian crisis that is going on, when we think about other groups. But these are 3.5 million Puerto Ricans that are going through this situation. And when we're talking about those structures of transforming, not rebuilding, but remaking a little bit what's going on out here. And we know for a long time, and I don't have to get you through the issues out here, but historically, the U.S. has treated us as less kindly than other groups, and it could be based on race, it could be based on language, it could be based on different ethnic or cultural ideals out here. But one statistic that I want to get to you right here, you imagine that Maryland lost 65,000 people in 1 year? What would be sort of the outbreak? Outside of a humanitarian crisis, we don't think about this. And already I told you the health outcomes are really bad so far. And you imagine sort of the situations that are going on out here. And this we shouldn't be surprised about this, because this is a result of historical negligence and mistreatment, and it seems to happen in minority communities. It seems to happen in places where we mistreat and neglect people, and this is part of sort of those issues of how racism actually leads to these policies that leads to these outcomes. So with that, I just wanted to give you kind of like that perspective of some of the things that are going on, and I'll be happy to take any questions when I'm done here. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Arjman Siddiqui, who's Associate Professor of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Dr. Siddiqui's work focuses on the role that societal conditions play in shaping inequities in population health and human development. In particular, her research utilizes a cross-national comparative perspective to understand the consequences of social welfare, policies for inequalities in health, and developmental outcomes. So welcome, Dr. Siddiqui.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's great to be here. Just, is it on the same PowerPoint or? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we've been doing to understand how the relationship between race and health varies across societies and why that might be the case. And I'm reminded of a colleague and friend, Dan Zuberi, a sociologist, who did a study in which he examined the well-being, the general well-being of low-income immigrant hotel workers in Seattle and in Vancouver, Canada. And he made the case in his book, Differences Matter, where he said, so life for the working poor in Seattle is strikingly harder and more stressful than for their neighbors here in Vancouver. He says it's not because folks in Seattle are lazier or dumber than folks in Vancouver. It's because laws have created wildly different environments in the two cities and in the two nations. And it's this sort of perspective that I've hoped to explore in terms of the relationship between race and health. And if you think about the kind of literature that we've been producing on race and health, the main ideas that have really come forth is that race is associated with health because of racism, and that this plays out primarily in two ways. One is that racism affects access to material resources that are essential for health, and the other is that racism produces an actual physiological response of the sort that David mentioned that also influences health. And I'd argue that where we've spent most of our energy, where we've paid the most attention, is sort of downstream on the sort of behavioral and other kind of proximal pathways that influence health. We know when we say that racism matters, we know when we say this is because of material resources and so forth, but we spend most of our time trying to figure out how to change health behaviors in racial groups that are most compromised. And part of the curiosity I have is what happens when instead we focus upstream on the kinds of institutional and societal factors that actually promulgate much of this relationship. Things like the welfare state that Celeste mentioned, income inequality, levels of social spending, the extent to which services are universalized, and so on and so forth. And I've tried to explore this by comparing two societies that have differences in their institutional makeups, Canada and the US. So these are countries that are fairly similar in a lot of ways and yet have very different levels of income inequality. Canada has lower income inequality, has higher levels of social spending, greater universality in many of its services, and so forth. And so the question is, if you have two societies in which these institutional factors are different, do we see a different relationship between race and health? And this is data from Canadian and American national surveys in which we looked at a variety of health outcomes. On the far left, heart disease, then hypertension, obesity, smoking, heavy drinking, and self-rated health. And in the blue bars are the odds for blacks compared to whites in the US of each of these outcomes, and in the red bars are the odds for blacks compared to whites in Canada for each of these outcomes. And what this graph essentially suggests is that it is the case that the black-white health gap in Canada is not as pronounced as it is in the US. So for example, in the case of heart disease, both blacks in Canada and blacks in the US are relatively protected compared to whites, but to a much greater extent in Canada. Blacks compared to whites have lower gaps in hypertension in Canada compared to the US. The obesity rate, the obesity gap in the US is much greater than it is in Canada, and so forth. And what we try to understand is whether that is a result of some of the traditional determinants that we think matter: age, gender ratios, income, education, unemployment, and so on. And when we controlled for all of those factors, we found something really interesting, which is that in the US, the health gap stayed similar or slightly declined, meaning that part of the reason blacks were doing worse than whites in the US is precisely because of things like health insurance, education, employment status, and so on. While in Canada, the health gap actually worsened after adjusting for these covariates, implying that part of the reason they are more protected in Canada is because the income gap is less pronounced, the unemployment gap is less pronounced, and so on. So the preliminary sense that we have is that the social determinants in Canada are less maldistributed than they are in the US. And as my friend Dan would say, it's not because people in the US are dumber or lazier, it's precisely because institutions in these two countries have made circumstances really different. Thank you.
Our last panelist today is Dr. Abigail Sewell, who's assistant professor of sociology at Emory University. Her work focuses on the political economy of racial disparities, and in particular, her work focuses on policing, environmental justice, and redlining.
Okay. So the brevity of Black life in my own personal life is what brought me to begin thinking about the ways that the lives we live contribute to the early onset of our death. R.I.P. Prince Rogers Nelson. I didn't know the name for it at the time, but I now know it as structural racism. When I was listening to your presentation, I was actually thinking of the phrase by Roderick Wallace of synergism of plagues. And in the places that we can describe as structurally racist, there is a synergism of plagues that leads to people having different types of opportunity structures that in fact invoke health problems. So the problem I grapple with is the one of quantifying the health and the health disparity effects of structural racism. One of the most popular ways of measuring structural racism is developing a segregation measure. However, most studies that adopt this approach do not attend to the institutional and systemic factors that create segregation. And this is where my work takes life. To really characterize segregation as a root mechanism of racial health disparities, research should attend to the actions and inactions of institutional gatekeepers that lead to racially stigmatized people living in different spaces than racially marginalized people, racially privileged people. Instead, segregation is treated as a root cause, a mechanism at the origins of health inequality. Yet segregation at its most basic level is simply a measure of where people live. Taken at face value then, it is an institutional measure of structural racism and an inappropriate measure of institutional racism in housing. I argue that segregation is not a root cause, but rather a root effect. We must remember that the effect cannot be the cause. I have developed a multi-level root cause conceptual framework that focuses our attention on the dynamic processes that undergird the co-structuring of racial typification by institutional gatekeepers and the political economy of resource deprivation by these same institutional gatekeepers. The framework is called the racism-race reification process, and its primary thesis is that an ideology of race produces political economic structures that are implicated in racial inequality by way of neighborhood context. The key feature of RQP, as I call it, is that distinguishes it from other multi-level models of racial disparities is a concept of racist relational structures, which are institutionalized sources of treatment bias that develop out of the actions and inactions of institutional gatekeepers. So this is what RQP looks like. it posits that poor health risks begin with the political economy in which people are embedded. A key argument that I make is that political economies not only matter for shaping health directly, but also influence the racialized distribution of more immediate culprits of health disparities, such as ethno-racial composition, neighborhood socio-economic and ecological processes, household socioeconomic status, and poor street block quality. I'll show you the full one. RQ posits that racial health disparities are really just a function of the ways that racially marginalized people are clustered within institutional structures that manifest an ideology of race. A function of the ways that racially marginalized people are clustered within hazardous neighborhoods that are created by institutional structures that manifest an ideology of race. And a function of the ways that racially marginalized people are clustered within socially segregated spaces that are created by institutional structures that manifest an ideology of race. The clustering mechanisms linking racist relational structures directly and indirectly to racial group membership capture the true nature of the link between residential segregation and health disparities. An ideology of worth and difference based on a hierarchy of phenotypical features and developed through multi-level processes produces institutional structures that are codified in neighborhood contexts. Simply put, it is not segregation that is the root cause of racial health disparities, but rather the political economic processes that contribute to a racist social structure. So in a few minutes I have left, I will discuss an empirical test of RQP. Here is a time-sensitive representation of the data that I use. The individual level data on health comes from the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, longitudinal cohort study, wave 2. You can see that the measures of racist relational structures highlighted in kind of gray are actually measured prior to the outcomes of interest and prior to measures of neighborhood quality and ethno-racial composition, operationalized with data from the Neighborhood Change database and the PHDCN community survey. So the first part of this is actually showing that, in fact, the politically economic structures, the actual ethno-racial composition of the neighborhoods in which people live, which is, in fact, health risk. So I show you here the relationship between racist racial structures measured by aerial, mortgage, inequality indicators, and one indicator of ethno-racial segregation at the neighborhood level. That is the Simpson's Diversity Index. This table shows that neighborhoods with less access to the mortgage market are less diverse. This table also shows that neighborhoods where minorities are more likely to access private or less regulated credit are also less diverse. These patterns hold when thinking about changes in neighborhood ethno-racial diversity across time between 1990 and 2000. There is decreasing diversity in neighborhoods with less access to the mortgage market and neighborhoods where minorities are more likely to access less regulated mortgage credit. But also, there is less diversity in areas inundated with government-regulated credit, such as FHA loans, or what we call ghetto loans, or loans sold to government-sponsored enterprises such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The second part of the study shows illness-specific effects of the political economy. Living in neighborhoods where minorities are more likely to be denied loans than whites increases the risk of caregiver-rated poor health, while living in neighborhoods with a higher proportion of government-regulated loans, these quote-unquote ghetto loans, increases the risk of lead poisoning. Some of these effects, as with caregiver-rated health, are confounded by the economic characteristics of the neighborhood, but the lead poisoning associations hold. So in conclusion, the political economy has a central role in shaping both illness directly and the segregation context in which illness unfolds. The study I discussed today, which will be published as the lead article in the October issue of Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, shows that political economies represent contextual health risks that add to, not explain away, racial health disparities. Thank you.
Could I ask the speakers to please come up for our question and answer period? We also have index cards on all the seats. And if you would like to write down a question, we can certainly take them from you and ask the panelists your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to address this to the entire panel because they don't necessarily indicate if there's a specific person. So the first question is, we heard about HIV/AIDS. Is it the most pressing health concern? Or is it asthma, water pollution, or obesity, or bigger issues that we need to address? So if anyone wants to take that.
I really like that question, particularly, you know, as someone who is obviously working in the area of HIV. I think it's important to recognize that there are multiple issues to confront. And what I appreciate about the presentations today is that I don't necessarily think that the focus is or should be on one specific disease. I think that what we're saying is that multiple diseases have very similar pathways, mechanisms that end up having disproportionate impacts on communities of color and poor communities. So what we're really trying to understand, whether you're talking about HIV or diabetes or cancer or heart disease, are what are the specific mechanisms, and are those mechanisms, and how can we respond to them? And are some of the solutions transferable? So as I do my book as an AIDS researcher, I am really thinking more broadly about a bigger conversation about inequality and health disparities, and how this is actually a case that is illustrative of a much larger set of issues.
I'd chime in that you're exactly right. We're not looking at, we're not trying to privilege one indicator over the other, because in fact, it's the fact that people of color live shorter, sicker lives. So there's a measure, one of the measures that I use in my study, the caregiver ratings of poor health, is actually in adulthood an indicator of early mortality. And it's also an indicator of the fact that you'll end up dying of any number of causes later on in life. If you think your health is worse, it's a good sign that in fact it really is, and you're actually at risk for early death.
I really like that question too. And so, you know, what is the most, the quote unquote most pressing health concern? And when people ask me that question, I say racism is. And I think we need to understand I think we need to understand that racism is a public health issue. You know, we see, so the example I like to kind of give when we talk about what are the causes of death is an example that Tom Leviste gives. And he used to be at Hopkins, or he's en route to moving to George Washington, and he'll be the chair of the Department of Health Administration there. But he gives the example of the Titanic. And this is an example that I use in my classroom as well. And I'll ask students, you know, what was the #1 cause of death? You know, what was the leading cause of death for folks who perished on the Titanic? Now, you know, most students will say, oh, drowning or hypothermia, right? But could it have been something structural, like the lack of lifeboats? Could it have been the iceberg? Was that the cause of death? So, you know, really, when we talk about what are the pressing health concerns, I think we see, you know, we can ask, what's the leading cause of death? Now, if you ask a physician, you know, they'll say, oh, for blacks, it's heart disease. You know, but are we talking about gaps? Like, what are where do we see the greatest gaps in certain diseases? Are we talking about what are the underlying social causes? And so I think there's multiple levels on which we can answer that question. And you know, my perspective is that racism, the effects of racism cut across multiple different health outcomes and impact our health in different ways.
Great, thank you. Second question, and again, this is to the entire panel. How do we make sense of structural factors versus individual choices?
So maybe I'll take a crack at that. In my estimation, it's not really very useful to pit those against each other because what the conceptual and empirical sort of thinking shows is that the individual factors really seem to flow from the structural context. So in some ways, the importance of structural issues is the very fact that they actually shape the individual factors that shape health. So in other words, looking at structural conditions helps us to look at the root causes. And conversely, focusing on individual circumstances, individual behaviors, and so on and so forth, never really stems the tide that those factors come from. So you'll never really be able to do anything about the actual reason you see individual behaviors play out the way they do unless you get to the structural factors. Now, I think part of the reason we focus on individual conditions is because we are very sort of primed to do so. There's a very sort of individualistic narrative and mentality that flows through our society. And it's also much more difficult to address structural conditions. And so this combination of a individualistic narrative and the difficulty of changing fundamental features of society, I think, really conspire to make us focus on something that is not probably very useful to solving health disparities and solving the relationship between race and health.
I think another, another example of kind of this tension between the social determinants versus the quote-unquote proverbial individual determinants of health is, for example, Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, right? Now, I love Michelle Obama, right? Like, I really do. But, she basically says, get off your butt and walk around and exercise and eat vegetables and fruits and you'll be happy, right? And you'll be healthy. But it's one thing to say it, but you have to give people the structural resources to engage in these healthier behaviors. So if you live in a neighborhood without supermarkets, when you're living in a neighborhood with just corner stores, or if you're living in an area with high crime rates, with fewer recreational facilities, if you're more worried about putting food on the table than getting a jog in, it makes it difficult to engage in healthy individual behaviors. Another example is with HIV infection. Now, we see, for example, these huge racial disparities in the rate of HIV infection between black gay men and white gay men. Now, an individual interpretation for HIV infection is they had unsafe sex, right? Or they were using intravenous drugs. But actually, the research shows that black gay men engage in similar, if not lower levels of HIV risk behavior than white gay men. So if the behaviors are essentially the same, why do we see these huge disparities? And these disparities are more structural. So if you, with most infectious diseases, when you introduce the infection into a network that's more dense and interconnected, it's going to spread more rapidly. Now, there's evidence indicating that black sexual networks are more dense and interconnected than those of white gay men. Now, why is that the case? So if you ask black gay men who they're willing to have sex with, there really are no kind of racial kind of reasons for who they'll date. But when you ask white gay men who they're open to dating, they purposefully exclude black gay men. So in effect, black gay men are quarantined. The disease is quarantined within this community. And so it's spreading more rapidly. And so again, we're seeing its links to racism, right? So it's not the individual behavior that's explaining the disparity. In fact, individual behavioral explanations are very poor at explaining the racial distribution of diseases in this country. It's more structural.
Yeah, and I think also health becomes something that is very individual. We are socialized to experience the disease as an individual type of phenomena. So people go at great lengths sometimes to hide their diseases from work or their co-workers, So we sort of stigmatize that as well, and sort of pinning sort of that individual sort of experience from the structural causes out here. I don't think we have kind of like these discussions of, what are the most prevalent disease in my community? We never have those discussions. We look at health as a very individual sort of phenomena. And I think we need to change that mentality as well, because we need to start looking at, hey, you're not alone in the world when we have these factors out here. Why is it that we're dying of heart disease? Why is it that we're dying, we're suffering from obesity, hypertension, all those sort of things? That is not necessarily an individual phenomenon.
And I'd like to add, it's not really an addition, it's more so of let's rethink of what we mean by structural, because structures don't exist in and outside of the individuals that create them. So when we talk about structural conditions or structural risk factors for health problems, what we really are talking about is where the agency for dealing with those health problems actually lies. So in an individual context, or when we think about individual health behaviors or individual risk factors, the onus of the responsibility for reducing those health disparities lies on the individual that is sick. But when we make this argument, and I think all of us are making this argument in different ways, that in fact the real root causes of health problems, health disparities are in the structures in which people live, we're saying that in fact who is actually culpable for these problems is not necessarily the people who are sick. And that's why my work is focused on the actions and inactions of institutional gatekeepers, because we still need to hold somebody accountable. The question is, who will we hold accountable?
Great, thank you. Another question directed towards the entire panel. So the general U.S. public has a short and arguably biased attention span. Would you please discuss the potential impact of current and highly publicized worries about declining lifespan among certain white women and increasing usage of heroin among poor and rural whites, and what these kinds of publicized worries and highly publicized worries will actually have on your work that seeks to change the conceptualizations and narratives of health inequities among people of color and women of color in particular?
So I find this discussion incredibly interesting in several ways. One is that it is a real phenomenon and needs to be taken seriously, that there are sort of opioid patterns that have expanded in particularly, it looks like, white rural populations that are experiencing economic challenges that they haven't in the past. And I think what's really, there's been a lot said about this. One is how we framed the opioid epidemic relative to other drug epidemics, and I think there's almost no way to argue that there hasn't been a very dramatic difference in how we think about the opioid epidemic. We're very quick to point out the economic disadvantage argument, very quick to point out that it requires structural change to address. I think the larger issue, too, is that there is probably a link between the opioid epidemic and other health issues that have to do with the same kind of coping strategies, coping with disadvantage, coping with various sort of economic and social stressors. And it's very likely that different groups use different coping mechanisms. I think it's James Jackson has a really interesting paper about mental health prevalence in white women, sort of depression prevalence versus obesity prevalence in black women. And he makes an argument that you can't actually disconnect these two ailments because they both have to do fundamentally with some kind of coping. It's just that a different coping strategy is being used and it shows up differently in different populations and we treat it differently. So on the one hand, I wouldn't dismiss the opioid epidemic and I wouldn't dismiss the economic disadvantage that's occurring in populations in rural areas in particular, but I do think that there's a broader conversation, and that is that the economic disadvantage and social disadvantage that people of color have faced for a long, long time is not viewed in this same benevolent light, even though it's part of a similar sort of phenomenon, and in fact a more pronounced phenomenon, because it's not just economic disadvantage, but it's systematic racial and discriminatory disadvantage that they're experiencing. So it's not just that there's been job flight, but even in the presence of jobs, first to get fired, last to get hired, and this has been going on for some time and being ignored. So in fact, the opioid epidemic should really shed more light on what's happened to communities of color.
And I would just add to this piece about framing, the way in which it's been almost immediately medicalized and framed as a medical issue, and it's talked about as opiate and disease, and as opposed to the really harsh ways in which it was immediately criminalized. Addiction, that is, within communities of color. So even our response, is this a public health issue or is this a law enforcement issue? It has a fundamentally serious implication for how the community gets addressed and the ripple effects. And, as we all know, we're just now, it seems, beginning to have an impact on the ripple effects of mass incarceration and what that has meant for our way to deal with what was essentially a public health issue.
And actually, I think what's been striking to me is not just that it's been medicalized and treated as a public health issue, but I hear politicians talking about how they need to change policies in order to address this issue, which is so forget even not criminalizing it, they're talking about structural determinants. So they realize that they need to address structural determinants in order to address this issue in a way that has been completely absent for communities of color.
Thank you. So we have a couple more questions. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use your index card and I can take them from you. So the next question is, can the speakers comment on why we see comparably less research on the role of structural bias on health as compared to demographic characteristics or other group intrinsic explanations?
I'll take a stab. Although I think we actually have on this panel some of the foremost thinkers and researchers on actually measuring this stuff. But I actually think it's a measurement issue. I think that if we actually look into the particularly the sociological discourse, the social determinants of health discourse in public health, we have been talking about structural risk factors for quite some time. I can go back until even the 80s, where you can when we're specifically talking about race. When we think about racial health disparities, people modeling this stuff conceptually and talking about it theoretically. Empirically, however, one of the first studies that actually put institutional racism in the title of the paper was in 2002. 2002, that was nothing about 15 years ago, and it was using multi-level models. And so I know that David uses multi-level models in his study, or Jamon, you use multi-level models in your study, and I used them in my study. But we have to think about the whether we were empirically prepared as students in the 90s and the 80s to actually study the problems that we thought and knew were issues. We have those tools now, but they are actually a little bit more advanced. It's not like the first year graduate student can go run a model and know what's going on, and it takes a little bit more, I think you have to be a little bit more determined about getting those tools in order for you then to use those tools when it matters.
I'm just going to ask sort of an additional question to this. I'm wondering if you can speak about perhaps some of the funding biases and some of the deficiencies in funding that also sort of drive this kind of
Well, you think about NIH.
Right.
NIH does not fund policy work.
Right.
When I talk about what I do, people put it automatically in the policy realm. Now, in fact, NIH will fund some of this stuff, but you have to frame it in a way that fits within the biomedical model. Sure. And I think that's a disadvantage to structurally centered work getting out there if you are actually running after grants most of your time.
Also, I'll give a perspective from someone who's been on faculty in the US and now in Canada. The other issue in terms of NIH is that you have to get funding in order to support your salary. So this kind of work doesn't take very much money. So if you have data that's available and you know how to do your analyses, or even if you need to hire a student or something, it's not that much money to actually do this work. But we run around for grants, as Abigail mentioned, because it's a structural condition of our jobs, especially in public health. So, that's the other kind of piece of the puzzle. And I think the other thing I wanted to add to Abigail's nice comment about the measurement is that the data to actually conceptualize what these structures are and the ability to model multiple structural conditions at the same time has been a challenge. I think David's work is really, really at the forefront. It's very pioneering. We really haven't had measures like that of area level racism that I can recall at all. So we try to use proxies, but they're often weak proxies. And I think Abigail's right. It's a new era. There are newer methods that we're using. We're learning more from, for example, econometrics and so on, to allow us to do a better job of modeling this stuff. So my work has often relied on this sort of vague notion that there's something different about Canada and the US in terms of their political economies, but to identify what specific parts of their political and economic structure make the largest or smallest difference is a lot harder.
And I guess in terms of, we need to have our voices be heard, because, there's been talk about cutting funds for the U.S. Census Bureau, for the American Community Survey, sources that are very important to do our work. And I know we're in the era of big data. I mean, you have a cell phone, you're transmitting some type of data right now. But we need to exercise our rights as citizens and members of the community on people that we elect as well. So we need to put a little bit of pressure so these issues don't go away. I will hate that all of a sudden we cannot do this work because we don't have the funding, or all of a sudden we don't have the data sets, or we don't have the information that we need. That is basic, and it's not that expensive. When we're talking about those issues, it's not that expensive. It's just, it might not be popular in certain circles, but we need to be on the forefront to continue the type of work that we're doing.
Great. So the next question is, can capitalism meet the broader infrastructural needs described for transformation?
I feel like this is a setup.
This has been broadcast live.
It's a setup, and I'm not responsible for anything I say. However, I mean, here's the thing. I think capitalism could work if we incentivized reducing inequality. So there are some studies in sociology about how businesses that diversified make more money. There's tons of organizational studies out there like this. Now, how many organizations actually see an economic benefit to diversity? They see it as a social issue. But if there was an economic incentive to reducing health disparities, not just the Healthy People 2010 goal, but an actual, for instance, more federal money going into studies that reduce health disparities, or the Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities, if we actually had more funding, then it could start to work towards that. But I do think we are in a situation politically and economically, and political economically, that does incentivize inequality. And so from that perspective, I would say that capitalism is not designed really to reduce health disparities.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that fundamentally capitalism's goal is not to bring about equality. And so it's a challenge to view capitalism as a primary source for equalizing resources between groups. That's fundamentally not what it's set up to do. On the other hand, it's not the case, I don't think, that a capitalist society cannot bring about at least much greater equality than you experience now. And I sort of totally rely on empirics in this case. So if you look at the major sort of advanced economies in the world, the richest countries in the world that are, at least ostensibly democracies, they're all capitalist. It's just that they regulate their capitalism to a far greater extent in terms of fundamental human resources, fundamental resources that you need to lead a decent life. They regulate that stuff much more in some countries than others. So in the Scandinavias of the world, they kind of remove things like healthcare, education, and so on from the market economy in order to make sure that those things at least are provided in an egalitarian manner. They regulate the distribution of income much more heavily than you would find in the United States. So I think capitalism, it's sort of a red herring to say that, you know, we should do away with capitalism. I think more to the point, at least in the realm of some reason, is that we should think about ways to manage capitalism so that it works for us rather than we working for it, in a way that we can prioritize creating equality of at least fundamental resources.
And I think particularly working both ends of the stream is important when you think about the fundamental policies, but also the ways in which in our day-to-day lives, what rising income inequality has meant is that we are increasingly segregated on the basis of class. So of course we have been long segregated on the basis of race and class, but particularly this notion of people at the top being able to basically self-select out of a variety of different realms, from the neighborhoods that they live in and the schools that their kids go to, but also the gyms where they work out, the networks they're in, the recreational places where they vacation, how they vacation, all of these different ways in which common contact comes, cross-class contact may come. There are ways in which that is being systematically eliminated so that people at the top are experiencing something where they really don't have to interact with anyone who is economically different from themselves unless those individuals are serving them in some capacity. So it's really critically, you know, particularly for someone who's a qualitative researcher that really wants to understand process and how these interactions take place, paying attention to both of those ends of the spectrum becomes critically important. And being on a college campus, you know, this is one of the spaces that we have to protect this notion of, if we're in a capitalist economy, we still have to hold dear this notion that diversity in economics and in race and in a variety of different spaces of difference is critically important to make sure that people are at least aware of some of the disparities and the dynamics around them. The awareness has to happen before we can even begin to affect some of these policy changes. There has to be some level of investment and buy-in. So going back to the question about the opiate epidemic, if that's what it takes, it's sad, but if that's what it takes for us to have a national conversation about substance abuse, the awareness piece of it was critical. And that's what sparked the conversation, but it was also around who was infected and how people understood who was infected. And if we continue to be in these spectrums of them versus us, I think it will further deepen how we're experiencing our brand of capitalism.
Okay, so the next question I have, and it's a series of 3 questions for Dr. Watton-Hayes. So first, what is the relationship with male HIV individuals? You mentioned structural issues, but what about the interpsychic and mental health issues that affect your project? And finally, what happened with Dawn's relationship with her biological children?
Oh, okay, thank you. I was so short on time. So the first question...
the relationship between men and women, so particularly men with HIV.
Oh,
Yes.
men with HIV.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, not the men in their lives. Okay. Well, I think it's an interesting question. Women in the epidemic have really had to kind of struggle as it relates to finding their place in terms of getting access to services. So from the beginning, because the epidemic was framed around the experiences of white gay men, there was a way in which the experiences of women living with HIV was obfuscated from the very beginning of the epidemic. So what we've seen over time are ways in which women have really, through their political activism and their work within these institutions, really pushed for a place on the agenda, but also pushed for services and access to services, and pushed for the medical research to reflect what's happening with women versus what's happening with men. But they're still seen as a kind of minority participant in the discussion around HIV, particularly because of the demographics of the epidemic and the fact that men are disproportionately affected. The second question.
In terms of the importance of the sort of the interpsychic and mental health issues.
Oh, critically important issue. So I think that, I mean, and you obviously saw that in Dawn's story. Essentially what she was doing was self-medicating to deal with the kind of structural constraints that she was facing, but also the individual, the violence that she had experienced, the sexual violence she had experienced in her life, and the physical violence that she was experiencing living on the streets. So when we think about mental health services, and this goes back to the importance of us to be able to work these issues from multiple angles, and the importance of recognizing, first of all, we've got to challenge the stigma around getting assistance around mental health, but also making sure that the services are there. Thinking about therapeutic services as not a privilege for people who are more resourced and can pay for therapists, but thinking of it as a piece of health, just like we think of going to the doctor to get physicals. Having access to those mental health services becomes critically important. And I think that for Dawn, so much, and many of the women in our study, so much of that transformation was about getting access to mental health services that help them navigate and negotiate the dynamics that were currently happening to them, but also the traumas they had experienced in the past. So I would place that high on the agenda in terms of what the needs are. As it relates to her children, so China ended up being the kind of central figure there who kept the family and kept the siblings together, because she was in conversation with all of her siblings while her mother was struggling. And really, whether they were staying with family members or in the foster care system, she was able to really push to make sure that the family could at least stay in contact with each other, even if they weren't living together. So when Dawn was able to get clean, it was China who basically facilitated the kind of rebuilding of the relationship. So she's very close with her mother, and Dawn is very close to her daughter. She is working on her relationships with her sons. As you can imagine, there's a lot of anger there on the part of the kids in terms of what happened. And they are not always able to offer the structural explanations. They wanted their mom. So the ways in which Dawn sees as part of her rebuilding process, recognizing that too has to be rebuilt, and that too takes some institutional support. So Dawn's therapist, in fact, has been quite helpful in helping to facilitate the conversations around how do we heal and how do we rebuild from what had happened in the past.
Great, thank you. So this is going to be our last question, and I think this is a really appropriate question to end on. So how do we begin to address these structural inequalities that you've also sort of passionately talked about? What do we do in terms of actually building the infrastructure for reducing health disparities?
I'll start since the mic is well, I think a couple of things. Number one, the area that I tend to focus on is the meso level. So I do think that a key intermediary between these larger macro dynamics that feel so large and unwieldy and the individual experiences on the ground are the role of institutions. I think in some ways those are easier needles to move in terms of making sure that we have the nonprofit services and the resources that are assisting people in really critical ways. So I tend to focus on what are the infrastructures that seem to work? What are the services? What are the tools that seem to be working on the ground level within communities? And I think that they need to be supported. I'm, seeing Janice Johnson Diaz in the back, who works with the Grassroots Community Foundation, founder of the organization, and the ways in which organizations often have a very clear ear to the ground while at the same time understanding the structural constraints and figuring out ways to channel the resources, to be a voice, and to push policymakers in particular directions that make sense on the ground. So I've been really interested lately on what's the role of institutions as an intermediary within that. And I think that the panelists will have some fabulous things to say about the larger structural things when we think about policy, we think about attitudes, when we think about how we understand who we are as a country and our responsibilities to each other.
So I think I'm going to tie in two comments. I love your comment, number one, because I work almost exclusively at the meso level, and thinking about the ways in which macro level conditions are manifested in and expressed in how meso level institutions co-opt resources, provide resources, etc. But there was something that Arjuman said that I think we need to pay attention to, which is within the system that we're living in, what is the role, what is the capacity of this system to transform itself? And I think it does start with regulation. So this is where my work on, and my focus on institutional gatekeepers come into play. Originally, I started this work thinking about the mortgage market and the ways in which the politics actually regulates the mortgage market, and the extent to which, when it's not regulated, what happens to these neighborhoods that get inundated with a lot of unregulated loans. And at least in a paper that is in progress, it shows that there's higher levels of asthma among kids who live in neighborhoods where minorities have more access to unregulated loans. But I also started to do this work with the criminal justice system and thinking about the collateral consequences of mass incarceration. And so we always have to think about who are the institutional gatekeepers. And for me, it was so clear: police. They're the ones who are actually enforcing the law. But who regulates police? And that's where my answer lies. I think we have to think about the systems that are regulating the institutions, not simply whether you have or don't have institutional resources, because in fact we could blame the police or we could blame the loan officer that issues the denial, but really it's the underwriter, really it's the politicians. Those are the ones who are actually creating this system and actually creating the rules by which the system is regulated.
I think also as sociologists, we need to understand the system a little bit better, how decisions are made, and sort of the importance of it, and how we translate that into actual concrete policies. And unfortunately, that's not an aspect that we're trained on. We're trained very scientifically, but kind of like getting to that next step. And that's what the importance of the work that we do in just serving in committees, serving in different capacities outside of just the university realm. I think is very important because we need to understand how decisions are made. And as you get older and you understand how things are made, it's not, people think it's a very rational, detailed thing, and it's not. And you wouldn't imagine having somebody at the table that knew about these conditions, how much of a change it would have done. And I think that we need to start thinking about how we can translate what we do into something that we speak their language as well, in terms of what is the economic benefit for them. I don't think we have had that conversation in full detail of, if you reduce the disparities, you're going to save billions and billions of dollars. And I think we need to start changing that discussion and actually training our people to have those discussions and sort of merge those worlds out there. Because I think it's important in terms of how we change the systems. Because, at the end of the day, everybody's part of the system, and what we've shown you is that some people benefit very much from this system.
So yeah, along those lines, I think it's very important to vote, and vote for folks who are going to promote policies that would help to eliminate racial disparities in health. I think we need a fundamental ideological shift. Certainly we've made progress legislatively in terms of addressing discrimination in specific domains, but I don't think we've really done much to change racism as an ideology. I don't think we've fully embraced the truth that Black lives matter. And if we really believe that, we wouldn't be putting up with these racial inequalities. So what can we do as people, as individuals, to kind of trigger this fundamental ideological shift? Well, again, one thing we as people can do is vote. The second thing that I think we can do is do what Dawn does, which is become an activist. Get up on your soapbox and go and change people's minds. When I look at the gay rights movement, they really made tremendous gains in a very short period of time. We're not there 100%, but really a lot of progress has been made. And what was it that enabled the gay rights movement really in just the past 10 years or so to take off so rapidly. It was people coming out of the closet, right? And so and part of it was AIDS. It brought people together. And so I think we need to alert people to the fact that there is a crisis on our hands, and really stand up for ourselves.
And particularly when you look at, if we use the HIV epidemic and the AIDS activism as an example of just one of the many issues that the gay rights movement adopted, there were multiple strategies, right? It was about coming out of the closet. It was about telling their stories, right? Think about how much kind of popular culture and media represented what life was like and humanized the lives of what it meant to be HIV positive, what it meant to be gay or lesbian. And the ways in which they were extremely aggressive at lobbying politicians. We may not remember the days where where AIDS activists were laying out in kind of collective death statements, and there was no fear about putting lives on the line visually to demonstrate the impact, and demanding and doing very intense displays, ACT UP being a great example, to get people to pay attention. The one caveat that I offer is that there was also white privilege operating very much in that same level of activism that helped to fuel the wheels there for people to pay attention, and we can't lose sight of that. But some of the tactics and techniques, nevertheless, were very important and useful. And when I think about what I'm trying to understand in terms of how we've been able to address the epidemic in the US, that infrastructure came through that activism and that push to say that gay lives, in fact, gay and lesbian lives matter, and people living with HIV have experiences that matter. So for some reason, when Black Lives Matter comes out, it's an issue and it's a challenge, and it's, well, everybody matters, and there's this immediate pushback. So there's a way in which our kind of racial hostility and animosity does not even allow us to allow certain groups to claim a space. And until, you're absolutely right, David, and until we're able to negotiate that, where people are even given the right to push for, we are going to be in a very, very difficult state. So the work continues, the fight must continue, and we must be visible, and particularly as academics, getting out of our ivory towers, because the resource that we have are data and the ability to tell stories and the ability to tell compelling stories. So not losing sight of that, and yes, publishing in the best academic journals, but also publishing op-eds and accepting speaking engagements with communities that we don't typically speak with, I think becomes critically important.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and for engaging with us. I particularly want to thank Dr. Celeste Watkin-Hayes for being our keynote speaker for this panel, and all of the panelists. Please just join me in thanking everyone here.
Before we break, I also want to say thank you to the moderator. You did a wonderful job, so thank you. Let's give her a hand. Like I said earlier, if I make a mistake or if I overlook someone, I have no problems coming up here and admitting it. So I talked about James Brown being the hardest working man in show business, and I had a shout out to my girls for all the work that they did, and I'm really a big proponent of Black Girl Magic and Black Girls Rock and Girls Rock and Girl Power. And so I am remiss to say that I forgot one of my girls. And so Melissa Brown, I truly apologize for not including you when I got up here, but I want to acknowledge you now that you do rock and Black girls do rock. So thank you for everything that you've done for CRI. Okay, and so, there's this whole thing of like verbal plagiarism. When someone says something, if you don't give them credit for it and you just take it, it kind of becomes verbal plagiarism. I so badly want to take Dr. Che's notion about racism being the major issue, health issue, pressing issue. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually give credit to David Che. And I think that's a really great way to end this session and to think about racism being the major health issue that we really need to tackle. And that's going to dovetail real nicely into the second session. The second session is actually going to look at health solutions. What can we do? Now that we've talked about these health outcomes, what kind of solutions can we think about? Can we negotiate? Can we navigate? And so we can kind of maybe bring down some of these health disparities that we do see. And so we're going to start at 2 o'clock, 1:59. We're going to start at 1:59 or at 2 o'clock. Two more things before we go. Again, like I was saying before, I really believe in acknowledging people that are in the room. And so I want to acknowledge two people that are in the room. One being my the current chair of my department. He actually had to walk out. And then my past chair of my department's also here too. So I wanted to acknowledge him too. So Reeve Vanneman, just kind of wave your hand. I have a true affinity for Reeve because Reeve took me through my tenure process, so he will always be near and dear to me. And then lastly, for my students that are in the room, thank you for coming, 1. 2, if you are looking for a job, I'm gonna need for you to make your way over here to the health fair and talk to Richard and James at City Year. Because they have jobs that relate to some of the stuff that we've been talking about. So my students, you get extra credit. Go over there, talk to them. I will write you letters of recommendation. Get over there. Also, during the break, please be sure to visit the vendors for the health fair. So that's all that I want to say. I'll see you back here at 1:59.